Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Vanessa Nord. I'm Creative Director of the Building Centre. So I wanted to welcome everyone tonight very briefly before we start this evening off with our amazing speakers. I think we all realise by now that technology is not benign. I was reading this week that Canadian physicist Donna Strickland doesn't have a Wikipedia page because she wasn't deemed important enough. And that was after she has just won the Nobel Prize for Physics. So I think we probably know the world isn't feeling particularly benign at the moment, but let's not dwell on that too much. This evening has come out of this year's RCA Built Environment Trust Student Prize for Innovation, which was awarded to the brilliant Hannah Rozenberg for her project Building Without Bias. Hannah had found that artificially intelligent technologies understood architect, steel, cement, and screw as terms mostly associated with men, while tea room, kitchen, and nursery were amongst the most female. With algorithmic design methods set to increase, what will be the implications for architecture? That's something amongst many other interesting things we'll be exploring tonight. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce you to Hannah, who is the creator of Building Without Bias and the inspiration for this evening's talk. Florence Okoye, a user experience designer interested in the application of design thinking to complex engineering systems and founder of Afrofutures UK. Marina, Otero, Verzier, director of research at the New Institute in Rotterdam, curator of work, body, leisure, and I am just reading from here, the Dutch Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale, and she worked with After Belonging Agency for the Oslo Triennale as well. Nina Power, who's senior lecturer at philosophy in Roehampton University and the author of One Dimensional Woman. And I also wanted to say a big thanks to my brilliant colleague Harriet Jennings for organising this evening's talk. So yeah, thanks everybody and thanks Harriet. And I'll hand you over to Hannah.
I would like to start this talk by asking you all to think about a few things. First, please think about how often you've relied on Google Search or Google Translate in the last few days. Now think about whether or not you've used any type of artificial intelligence assistants, such as Siri or Alexa, or even a bot on the website. I ask you to think about these things because you may not know, but all of these tools that we use on a daily basis, have gender biases embedded in them. And that's the topic I want to talk about with you today. I believe we're at an extremely important moment in time where automation is taking over our spaces, buildings, and devices. And as the world becomes more reliant on artificial intelligent machines, it is essential that they be designed without gender bias, without any type of toxic biases. However, I realize this is not the case. And many of these technological tools that we use do, in fact, amplify existing gender inequalities. My final year project at the RCA, Building Without Bias, an architecture language for the post-binary, explored whether architecture could be used as a tool to reveal and revise some of these toxic biases. I was very lucky to be invited to exhibit my work here at the Building Center during the month of August. And today I feel privileged to be able to talk about it with you tonight. I will divide this presentation into 3 parts. I first want to talk about the different sources of biases in technology. I will then explain the methodology I developed in response to the issue. And finally, I will show you the architecture that I designed to test the methodology. So first, the different sources of biases in technology. When investigating the way machines are designed and used, I identified 4 sources of biases in technology. These are highlighted in red in the diagram and include the data, the programmer, the testing, and the user. So first, machine applications gather data for machine learning. The problem here is that this data often reflects the implicit human biases. For example, word embedding is a technique that I was very interested in that is used in AI development. The method teaches language by giving machines numerous texts, such as Google News articles. The machine processes them and creates links between words, which result from the way in which they're associated with one another. The machine learns, for example, that what a man is to a woman is what a king is to a queen, which is fine. But it also understands that what a man is to a woman is what a computer programmer is to a homemaker. So these two lists of words represent the occupations that have the closest links to the word he on your left and to the word she on your right. This type of machine learning has an impact on algorithms that we use every day on search engines, such as Google Search or Google Translate. For instance, Google translates non-gender pronouns to female or male ones, depending on the accompanying words. If one is, for example, to write, she is a leader and he is an assistant, from English to Estonian, which is a non-gendered language, but then to swap back to English, the algorithm automatically changes the pronouns to put he with leader and she with assistant. Sorry. Another example of the source of bias in data is recent research that has shown that the top 100 recruitment pages that are now powered by algorithms online were shown 6 times more to a group of men than to a group of women. This, of course, intensifies the existing situation in which women earn ATP for every pound that men earn. The second source of bias is the programmer. In Europe, only 11.2% of the leadership jobs in technology are taken by women. And Silicon Valley employs 3 times as many men as women. This results, for example, in anthropomorphized female AI, which is used for domestic and assistant tasks. This also reinforces the idea that there is no need to say please or thank you to a subservient female voice, and even allows men to make insulting comments to a female voice that replies with silly answers, as this video found on YouTube. Sexual robots are also becoming increasingly popular. These are exclusively designed by men and for men. The third source of bias in technology is the testing. So machines are often tested on poorly selected training data. For example, the company Carmet developed some pacemakers, but these only fit 20% of women, but fit 86% of men. Female drivers are 46% more likely to be seriously injured in a car crash. This is because the test dummies are all based on the male figure. The algorithms that regulate the temperature in contemporary office buildings are tested on the 155-pound men, which means that women who are typically smaller feel cold. And finally, the voice recognition devices didn't used to recognize females' voice. Now they have improved, but it's still proven that the technology is calibrated on the male's pitch of voice. The last source of bias is the user. So machines supposedly learn from their users, but actually often just learn from the user's prejudices. This is a good example of it with Tay, who is a bot that was developed by Microsoft, but it only survived 24 hours online because it became so sexist and racist that they had to remove her. So these are only a few examples of the important issue of gender bias in technology. I believe the issue is not assessed nearly enough and is alarming as technologies are increasingly taking over every part of our lives, while the number of women in the tech industry is not increasing fast enough. So this brings me to the second part of the presentation, the methodology I designed in response to the issue. As an architectural designer, I decided to use my medium to highlight and attempt to revise the issue. The methodology I designed is based on the word embedding technique I explained earlier. So as a reminder, word embedding is the technique used in AI development in which machines process a large number of texts in order to learn language. With the help of a software engineer, I created a website that is accessible to everyone. The link is above. The website uses an algorithm similar to that of Google Translate to measure a word against the gender with which it is most commonly associated. When entering a word into the search bar, a gender value is returned. This value shows whether machines currently see that word as male or female. The numbers that I have named GU, or gender units, are based on an algorithm that was trained using Google News articles. The website may be used in many disciplines, but when applied to architecture and design terms, it reveals that according to machine, what concrete, steel, and stadium are to men, what lace, glass, and kitchen are to women. If one is to design a space that is seen as neither male nor female by the machine, the architecture should be composed of elements that equal 0 gender units, 0 GU. Using this rule, I defined a series of GU0 architectural components. In the eyes of the contemporary machine, these components are, as a result of the way they're labeled, non-binary, neither male nor female. So all of these are examples of the GU0 architecture components, which helped me to test the methodology and then to design the architecture. So this brings me to the last part, which is the architecture I designed. To further explore the method, I chose as a testbed the area of St. James, also known as Clubland. In 2018, St. James, is still a very exclusive area with many gendered businesses and gentlemen's clubs. These institutions are visited by white, wealthy men, and their doors are often closed to women or to those who do not belong to this elite. I designed 5 interventions that purposely disrupt the existing situation of the area. So focusing on the streets of Pall Mall and St. James Street, the gray buildings are the gentlemen's clubs, and the black ones are my interventions. The purpose of these spaces, from furniture to an entire building, is to retrain the way we use language. Since technology reflects the biases embedded in a language, the first step towards gender-neutral technology is a gender-equal language. Therefore, the 5 interventions represent the 5 ways of using language: speaking, reading, viewing, writing, and listening. Using my methodology, I wrote the formulas that would dictate the GU of the design. Depending on the scale of the space, these took into account the architecture elements, the colors, the materials, the typologies of the design. So the interventions all equal 0 gender units and are, in the eyes of the machine, non-binary, neither male nor female. So first, I designed a series of benches that invite visitors to sit down and retrain the way they speak to one another. This specific bench brings attention to the back entrance of the club boodles, through which women have to enter when visiting the gentlemen's club, rather than using the front entrance like the men. In this case, the design equals 0 gender units because of the architectural elements that compose the space. The addition of the words canopy, ladder, wall, 2 times windows, door, balustrade, bench, and ramp equals 0 gender units. Therefore, according to the machine, this space is neither male nor female. To bring attention to the way language is used when read, I designed a library at the corner of Pall Mall and St. James Street. Inside, the gender units of the words is constantly calculated and displayed to the visitors. To draw attention to the way language is used in films, I designed an outdoor cinema that faces the Athenaeum Club. The newspaper office retrains the way language is used when written. It is located inside the Economist Bank building, and the facade was redesigned to equal 0 gender units. And the last intervention is a theater, which is located inside White's Gentleman Club. These 5 interventions are hypothetically part of a larger master plan to ensure an optimally genderless St. James. I imagine that the architecture or development of the area would always be compared against a digital simulation that maintains the architecture at GU0. As language and the gender units of words varies, the landscape constantly changes by adding, removing elements, and reordering existing parts of the context. Finally, I was keen to evaluate the success and the potential of the methodology. To do this, I fed the designs back into image recognition algorithms that use AI, such as Google Cloud and IBM. In a reversal of the design process, the machine took an image-based input and described it with words, therefore producing a text-based output. I then fed these words back into my algorithm to assess whether, in fact, I had achieved gender neutrality with my designs. Of course, it did not equal 0 gender units, but the images were recognized, and testing the methodology in this way allowed me to demonstrate the potential of the project. By designing the interface for my algorithm and creating a website, I hope to be able to share and disseminate the tool more widely. The idea being that through more extensive use, the tool could gradually become more accurate and intelligent, and thus most successful in battling the type of biases that I have identified. So to conclude, I would like to mention the fact that my project focuses on gender biases, but there's many other forms of toxic biases embedded in technology. As the world becomes ever more automated, I really hope that other ways of testing and controlling these technological tools will be developed. My methodology and design were my own response to the issue, my personal way of evaluating the gender biases in technology. But we need many other methods in all disciplines to understand better the way our machines work and prove that they're probably not as neutral as we think they are. Finally, I wish society thought more about the extent and impact at which it uses emerging technologies. Does everything need to be built? Let's think about who's going to be harmed by and who's going to benefit from these new technological tools before we start to use them. These are the type of questions I really hope society will ask itself in the future. And as an architectural designer, I really hope that architects will ask themselves these questions before starting to use new algorithms to design their spaces. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Just want to check and make sure that everyone can hear me. And right, okay, excellent, thank you. Okay, so yeah, so my talk, In the Shadow of Hateful Glass, and I hope to sort of raise some questions and obviously some thoughts about the design and development of the smart city that we increasingly see. As you can probably tell from the lead image, this was very much inspired by one of those wonders that I do through London. That's my hometown. It's been fascinating seeing how it's sprung up and radically changed in my lifetime. And with some of the questions that are raised around automation within the city, I was very much, and also to be fair, I'd been reading too much Philip K. Dick recently. The notion of living in a city that could potentially hate me struck me, actually, and hence the title of this talk. And so, as I was saying, I think what I find particularly interesting about the smart city, for all, of course, about the issues, about how we define smart cities, when is a city truly smart, and so on and so forth. What I find particularly interesting is that in many ways, the smart city can be seen as a kind of embodiment of a sort of abandonment of what the theorist Nathan Jurgensen calls digital dualism. So this perception of a difference between IRL, in real life, and away from keyboard. What he also calls a conceptual standpoint that kind of results in what was quite predominantly this, what we might say, a fallacy of web objectivity, this idea of the internet, of cyberspace, of the digital as this free, open, accessible world where everyone is somehow equal. If we think particularly about the case of the smart city, quoting from researchers like Sally Caird, what's interesting is that it's often conceived as a means of integrating quickly evolving technology into our living environments, thus offering us supposedly exciting solutions for new services, provision, and integrated city infrastructures, as well as obviously creating opportunity to support innovation, digital entrepreneurship, and sustainable city development. And yet, considering what we've seen in many other countries and indeed contexts where you could perhaps argue that aspects of what could be considered smartness in a city have rapidly developed, where credit and identification is tied to online and social media accounts, and our interactions with our environment, whether political or architectural, are connected to the very services that provide email accounts. That dualism, that notion of web objectivity, that split between our online selves and our real selves, can only collapse. And what's particularly interesting is that for someone like Jurgensen, this flattened digital dualism, as it were, is best initially exemplified in sort of discussions around augmented reality, right? So something that by its very existence promotes the idea that the atom and the bit can enmesh to create a new reality. And so I think for those of us who are interested either as designers or thinkers around the smart city, in a sense now the smart city acts as a literally augmented reality, where the limitations of the postmodern, post-industrial space are in various ways exacerbated, superseded, expanded, and exploded. Thus, the smart city as an embedded augmented reality is in itself this collapse of is in itself the site of collapse of this digital dualism. And as has been sort of mentioned before, and there's been a spate of recent headlines which have made it very clear that, as well as the limits and reaches of the city, when it comes to the digital fabric, that there are many other things that also get exacerbated, superseded, expanded, and exploded. Behavioral data structured by and riddled with social inequalities arising from the hierarchical dynamics, such as the oppressive combination of structures such as classism, sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and so on, once fed into neural networks, often find themselves amplified to create embedded alternate realities in which humans that are placed within a kitchen, for example, are coded as female, in which the black person is identified as a gorilla. And I always like to point to this example. It is a bit of a cliche by now, but it's particularly fascinating because it highlights a lot of the issues, not just around how we train and design these sort of technologies, but also our hubris in terms of how we think we can mitigate the damage that gets done. Here we also have a system potentially where 20% of the global population are considered to have unreadable facial expressions according to Western developed technologies, with an additional 20% potentially unseen, potentially glitches. When I talk of glitches, what I'm doing here is actually referring to some work by another theorist who's actually recently very much inspired me, Legacy Russell, who in her work to define and develop what she calls the sort of glitch feminism, one that essentially embraces the causality of error, to quote, and turns what she calls the gloomy implication of glitch on its ear by acknowledging that an error in a social system that has been already disturbed by economic, racial, social, sexual, and cultural stratification and the imperialist wrecking ball of globalization may not, in fact, be an error at all, but rather a much-needed erratum. The glitch as a correction to the machine and in turn providing a sort of positive departure from it. And so in light of this notion of the glitch, in light of this notion of something that can potentially disturb an already disturbed embeddedment, when we consider the capability of our own software to both replicate and inflate, it always pays to examine what biases and systemic violences that we are effectively encoding, or at least potentially effectively encoding, into our smart cities, to consider more deeply who amongst us here could be considered the glitch in the eyes of this watchful glass. So if we kind of take maybe not so much a step back, maybe looking a bit more deeper into this context we currently are in now within the City of London, what's fascinating is that this is a city which actually has some of the highest poverty rates within this country and certainly within Western Europe, with inner city boroughs being amongst the poorest, where 27% of residents are living below the poverty line after including housing costs. And in terms of housing, more particularly interesting if we're talking about the built environment, we see that increasingly poor families are being pushed to outer London as changes, say, to local housing allowances have meant that fewer properties in inner city boroughs are actually affordable. And in fact, there was a study done in 2011 by the LSE that predicted that by 2016, so that's 2 years ago, most of the inner London boroughs were very likely to become almost entirely unaffordable to low-income tenants. If we think then also about the wider context, again within this vast and beautiful metropolis where a fifth of the jobs are actually paying below the London living wage, where we still have a not insignificant digital divide, which again is exacerbated across the usual gradients of access needs, so disability, as well as gender and class. Issues still exist around police brutality and surveillance. A recent report that showed that black people, who make up 13% of the London population, are disproportionately more likely to be targets of police force by almost 3 times. This particular report showed that the incidence involving black people was around 36%. So if we consider all of this in the context of the fabric of the smart city as an augmented layer upon already existing geographically contingent inequalities, we must seriously consider the likelihood of smart city infrastructure at best mirroring, at worst amplifying, the existing gradient of access. From the perspective of an interrogatory service design, it can thus feel, in a sense, that we are kind of at an impasse. We have a system of increasing sophistication upon which the responsibility for ever more critical outcomes are placed. And if we are still eroding, and not always successfully, notions regarding the objectivity of technology, the existence of this digital dualism that I've just explained, and the existence of sustained, well, indeed, I would say to make it clear, kind of the fallacy of this existence of sustained near exponential rates of progress and development on our terms, and by that I'm implicating those of us within the developed world, then if that is still very much a problem when we're talking about technologies, the practical questions of cybersecurity, of software and product development methodologies are, if not moot, then at least likely to remain purely academic, enabling industry thus to carry on as usual, merrily chugging along without appreciating the dangers that these very modes of operations themselves pose to the societies that they are meant to be helping. Increasingly these days, I tend to focus in my practice on 2 paradigms. So firstly, community-centered design approaches, where the designing authority is decentralized and dispersed amongst the people who will need to live in the system being designed supposedly on their behalf. And that's something that I get to sort of experiment with and test out with through service design events, design jams, and even in sort of my everyday practice within a museum where I currently work. And this is equally complex in many ways, particularly when think about how this can be scaled up to the level of creating new smart city infrastructure. Because immediately what happens is that one is confronted with issues around funding, political and civic access. In many ways, sorry IDEO, but the ability to apply design thinking is almost the easiest part of the challenge. The second paradigm that I'm interested in, and this I will confess is still on more of a theoretical level, is actually how we can, as designers, go about embedding chaotic and complex dynamics into the fabric of the designed object itself. After all, at the heart of a complex system is the ability to self-evolve. And so I think the question for us is that how, as designers, can we design feedback loops into the very fabric of the stuff we're making, which can, in some ways, visualize the dawning amplification of biases, either alerting system owners that a check needs to be enforced, that a redesign must be rebooted, as it were. Something that at this stage, as I said, is more a theoretical question for myself, in part because what I think it requires is an overt reconceptualization of the design process as part of the design itself, something I don't think we as user experience or service designers have quite succeeded in putting into practice. Fundamentally, there is a need to recognize that our work in providing a critical perspective, be that a view on the innards of methodology, of technological production and funding, or the dynamics that arise when social inequalities meet structures of governance and so on, ultimately, we have to realize that this is not finished, not even in its initial stages. In this time of acceleration promoted by fairly large movers in IT, there is no question now of technological development halting for us to catch up with the agreed moral and ethical positions. Quite simply, it has shown that it doesn't care. To quote Juan Oliver, what's interesting is that we need to remember that with ubiquity comes ignorance, and it seems to be a plottable, predictable curve. The idea, therefore, of being a critical designer is to intervene at this point and say, no, stop. We need to reflect on what we're working with and how we depend upon, and how what we depend upon is shaping us. So learning this hard stuff, and by that, really getting to the innards of how technology is developed, how technology is designed, how it's put into production, how it's tested, how it is then reevaluated to be upgraded, how upgrades themselves are dispersed amongst the society or the community that is beholden to the system. All of this stuff needs to be learned and to be grappled with and to be understood in order to evade this top-down, the top-down superstructure that we often find. I suppose, really, in everyday speak, the fact is that when it comes to the question of the smart city, and I happily admit to perhaps being slightly more cynical than I should be, much of these innovations are driven by business, are driven by financial imperatives, are driven by councils trying to appear quite clever and advanced compared to others. And I think that's clear when you look at some of the supposed solutions that we see. It's interesting if you seriously sit back and think, okay, so how many people on these particular streets have actually been even made aware that their very data is being used to design and develop systems that are actually quite invasive, intrusive, and are in many ways actually leeching off resources that they themselves are in need of, and all quite unaware. As such, I think it's really crucial for those of us as designers to pursue, grapple, and sink our teeth, quite frankly, into this behemoth that is the tech industry. The issues arising from embedded biases and our knowledge of complex system dynamics shows that it is primarily by infecting the status quo, by habitually reintroducing the glitch, that we might be better placed to confront resultant dynamics. And so again, I'm left as a designer wondering, as designers, how are we to truly glitchify this hateful glass? Thank you.
Good evening. Well, first of all, thank you to the Building Center for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today, and in particular in such a good company, because all the speakers have been fundamental in developing the project I'm going to present, that is World Body Leisure, and includes automated landscapes. That is a research project that we have done at the New Institute in Rotterdam into the implications of automation in the built environment. So in conversations and events with Florence or Nina and now Hannah, this project has been taking shape over the last 2 years, and now is presented in Venice at the Venice Biennale. So what we did is to start analyzing and understanding the architecture of automation, full automation that has been implemented in the Netherlands. We argue that the Netherlands is a testing ground where to imagine the future of maybe a post-labor world, and to understand the technologies and also the architectures that make it possible, and that somehow render our dreams and anxieties about yet to come visible. So some of the spaces like the Port of Rotterdam, the APM terminal is fully automated. So all the workers that before were in those spaces have been replaced by self-driving vehicles, automatic cranes, and all sort of devices that create a super efficient landscape to manage all the containers. The workers have been now displaced into situation rooms where they control all these mechanisms and devices from the screen. Obviously, now these spaces are enclosed spaces where almost no human body is allowed to enter. And that is what happens most of the time with this type of automated spaces where technology drives and is more prominent. This is the landscape of Westland, also in the Netherlands. It's the agricultural cluster and is full of greenhouses. Also, these greenhouses show this tension between the earlier farms and spaces for agriculture in the Netherlands, and now these spaces that are enclosed gardens of sublime beauty in where like plants and flowers grow unrestricted by climate conditions and also the human body. But not only that, it's not only the human body and the bodies of the robots that are being designed to manage those spaces, also the other bodies. And this is the dairy farm also in the Netherlands where cows are attended by robots, and robots are being managed by the farmers who now control the operations from the iPad and the computer screen. But today we have been talking a lot about technology and maybe contemporary times, but these ideas about architecture and technology and automation in particular are not new. So we always refer in this research to the work of Constant, the artist, and his project for New Babylon. New Babylon was this architecture and this society organized not around labor, but rather around leisure. So it was thanks to automated machines that were mostly in the basement under this structure that was ever changing and occupying the entire world. These automated machines allowed humans to not to work. So it was an attempt to organize society around play and leisure. Obviously, what was an optimistic vision about the future, a future where no one has to work anymore and where basic needs are solved and are met. And as Constant evolved, his work evolved, this vision turned into be more conflictual space. So suddenly New Babylon started being populated by these stains of blood, and suddenly this space that it was imagined only for play started to be a space of violence as well. So what, this technological order that in theory will allow humanity to be liberated from work and from these kind of struggles associated with labor, suddenly render that violence is somehow inevitably connected to society. Now, 50 years later, we are in this moment where we see somehow that these automated spaces are even possible. Those things that were dreamed before, we are in a moment that might be possible to have a post-labor world. And obviously the bodies that are at stake here are also changing. So how different types of labor are also changing different types of bodies and the imagine and the way in which we categorize bodies. Architecture has been obviously always connected to this rendering of bodies and imagining different ways in which we position the body in relation to a space, how we measure it, and then how we change it. This is again the control center in the Rotterdam harbor, where now this is the type of worker who oversees the operation 24/7. And this is the architectures that prevent any other human beings to enter in the spaces where the machines now operate. Obviously, this brings a lot of conflict, a lot of protest among existing workers that see how their work is displaced. They are displaced and replaced by other types of workers. And it was also imagined by Constant in his own work. This relation between humans and machines has been in our imaginary for many years, and especially since the Industrial Revolution. What is the relationship between human and machine, and how the human body is adaptive to these mechanical activities and these processes. And it's again part of the architecture and for instance, the perspective work, how to imagine how the bodies are categorized, are rendered data, are rendered in a way that can be optimized and can be deployed into the design of spaces and the measurement of the world. So obviously this is Albert Dürer and how a female body is being transformed into a perspective drawing, how it's rendered again as data. But also this is the University of Utah, that our artist and designer Simone Kiel has been working for this particular project in Venice. It was one of the places in the Department of Computer Science where they were trying to do the first experiments in digitalizing human body. And this obviously is a female body being again rendered and transformed into data. And some of the people who were part of these experiments actually now form part of Pixar, for instance. So you see exactly the relation between these early experiments in computer science and these new digital worlds in which we are being embedded. Simone Kiel, again, tried to understand the relationship between these early experiments in perspective and how they have been also connected to the way in which we imagine digital spaces and bodies that inhabit those spaces. This is one of the early theatres in perspective drawing used by architecture as well, architects. And this is how Simone has imagined the space in the Venice Biennale with these inflatable dolls that talk about our relation to softwares and how we imagine the human body be rendered in 3D. And what she argues is these softwares that are being used for efficiency. So there are softwares that are being used for designing spaces of work, like factories, for instance, and they use databases in order to test bodies, test the human body, and how they relate to spaces and machines for safety, for different comfort, and obviously efficiency. So actually what she argues is these parameters that are being used come from particular databases that are only taking into account certain bodies, the bodies that are, rendered as the average or the rendered as normal. And what they left behind is all the other bodies that are not rendered as normal. So obviously there is a type of bias that is embedded in the design, and that is then transferred from these softwares into the built environment directly without us even being critical about it, just taking for granted that this data is accurate because it represents the average. But who is the average? And this case is Siemens is developing one of these softwares that at the beginning used only Jack. Jack was the avatar that was used to design worker in spaces. And obviously they realized that women were not taken into account. So they designed Jill. So this is, I introduce you to Jill here. And there are slightly, over time, different companies also introduced different databases because at the beginning they were used, for instance, using the bodies of the US military because obviously they were the bodies that had been scanned. So how then you can introduce different type of bodies according also to different geographies or different types of like communities, et cetera, and gender. So, but again, it's always particular bodies. Also in the working environments, it's not only that through technology, how they are designed by softwares in a particular way, but also automation is also affecting the human body as being automated itself. So these are some factories in China where we have been doing research. And in this case, humans have been not replaced by robots, but rather their work being efficiently designed by technology, who is actually measuring all the time their performance. And with a rabbit saying, you are performing well, you are doing things on time, or a turtle advising them to go faster because otherwise they wouldn't meet the needs and the expectations of the factory. So many times we think technology is going to come here to solve our issues and to assist us. And this, for instance, was in the 60s and 70s, the first automated kitchen, Electra, Technovision. And what is interesting is that it was supposed to assist women in the tasks connected to the kitchen and the housework, but not in any case to replace women. So it was not the case that we will say that women no longer have to be in the kitchen, but rather they will be doing domestic labor, but assisted by technology. So what we see is how technology not always necessarily liberates us, but many times perpetuates certain forms of exclusion and certain forms of inequality. And not only technology, like if we think about manuals that have been used by architects for many, many decades. For instance, this is a Neufert. If you see who is the body who is represented here to perform domestic labor, it's the woman. So for many decades, architects have been also, by using these manuals, perpetuating the idea that the invisible domestic or reproductive labor in the house is rendering a woman as housewives. And this is something that we just take for granted, and sometimes we don't even question when we apply it, or we tell our students to look at the Neufert to design spaces at the university. But things don't change that much when we go also to the other spaces of labor, whether they are like the domestic space or the office space. And there are new spaces as well that have been rendered also as working spaces. In the Dutch pavilion, we refer to the bed-in of John Lennon and Yoko Ono in Amsterdam. And they were protesting by doing a bed-in, and they were hosting interviews during the day, and then trying to, as Beatriz Colomina refers to, trying to conceive a baby at night. So it was a factory, 24 hours, that in one was like broadcasting images and ideas, and at night they were trying to reproduce, doing the productive labor. So it was what she calls a factory. And we reproduced this idea in the Dutch pavilion, and then we had kind of an intense marathon of people in bed talking about new forms of labor in relation to the bed and contemporary post-human labor. But we talk about bias in architecture, in this case, gender and beds. I wanted also, and we were reflecting about prostitution, and especially in the Netherlands, where these questions about prostitution, sex work has been normalized and are part of the design of the city. So this is a domestic space that at the beginning, it was the sex workers were performing their work in the same places where they were living. So this is Parijs in the red light district in early times. But now, this is some images from Tess Junglund of the red light district in the morning when these spaces are being cleaned. And as you can see, there is a modernist idea of these spaces that are completely organized in order to be efficient as the port, as efficient as the greenhouses, to perform a particular labor. And you can always see the tiles, the closet, the alarm, etc. So we see also how certain bodies are being organized around architecture and depicted in a particular way. Obviously, this is also a typology from the Netherlands that is the Tipple zone, and there were like these parking lots where customers could pick sex workers and have sex in the street, in the car. And here you can see also how these spaces, what says at the bottom is quite safe. That is also translated for safe sex. So it was these infrastructures as well. We have in our archive in the Netherlands a lot of brothel design, so also spaces for leisure that are conceived for also the sex work, exploitation of the woman body. And this is some of the union workers also in the sex workers in the Netherlands with a T-shirt with Margaret Thatcher saying, "We are all prostitutes." And maybe this tries to summarize what I've been talking about from the Neufert and many other things before. And the red light district in the Netherlands now is being transformed into spaces for creative work. And there are reports that claim that by 2050, there will be sex robots occupying the space that now is occupied by human sex workers. And Hannah was referring to sex robots as well. So here we can see how this heteronormative vision of the engineers are being transferred to robots, not only to assist men, as you were explaining, but also into this representation of a woman in terms of like sex dolls. In the UK, there is a 9% only of women in the computer, like engineer jobs. And in the computer engineer and AA, artificial intelligence designs, is even lower. So it's, somehow these conditions allow for a particular understanding of robots also and the female body in relation to technology. So the Foundation for Responsible Robotics, for instance, is talking about that, like how these are essentially pornographic representations of the female body. And a changing in the industry will also change many times, like the perception, the representation of women, and also the way in which we design in many cases. I refer back again to Constant and New Babylon, because in his latest paintings, suddenly it's more clear what these figures that at the beginning were only blood stains, what they were. And we see that suddenly they look like female bodies, but in a way we don't know exactly if they are robots or humans, or maybe there's doesn't matter anymore. But we see there is like this wire, the bodies are wired to the architecture. So we don't know if it's referring to what type of body. Maybe they are the bodies of these automated machines that are allowing the rest of the humanity to perform work that has been exploited and so, subjected to violence. And in that sense, we also in the Dutch Pavilion wanted to talk about how many other bodies over history had been also rendered as non-human and been exploited and treated almost like machines. And these are the doors of no return that Amal Allah has been doing research on for the Dutch Pavilion. And there was spaces that represent transatlantic enslaved trade, where many bodies were dispossessed from their belongings, their geographies, their identities, and in a way this also shows the unfolding violence that also continues to be the forced movement of the refugees and the migrants in connection also to bodies. And it's inevitable to think about architectures and the ways in which they are perceived as certain bodies when you think about, obviously, the doors of no return, but also the enslaved boats and the architectures that confine some of these bodies that were rendered as a workforce and even non-human. The way in which we also think about it is that these enclosures are not that far away from these other enclosures that are also creating certain forms of exclusion and perpetuating certain forms of inequality and exploitation. So we have to look at them over time and understand how these biases also that we see now in technology had been also present in many ways in connection to our design of architecture, but also our understanding of the organization of society around production. And this is just some images of the Dutch pavilion that we render also this abstract locker space that were opening certain windows or doors that will enter in these spaces that refer to architectures where the future of labor has been transformed. And some of them were the bed, and some of them this idea of architecture, of softwares, and how we inhabited these spaces and our relation to it. And it was a call for action. The idea was, many cases, architects are not interested in this type of spaces, like greenhouses or ports, or like even technology, because we are always a bit behind in comparison to technological, advances. So we always enter in the dialogue when the technologies are already almost in place. Our idea will be like through conversation like this one, institutions like this one, but also universities, other architectural associations, we start taking part in not only at the end of the process where technology is already in place, but how we as designers, as Florence was also saying, how can we intervene within it in an earlier stage and make sure that the spaces where we live are more equal. Thank you.
I'm just going to raise some general questions, as is my role as a philosopher. Also, I have some terribly designed slides, of course, because, again, I'm a philosopher. That's my excuse. So, yeah, I wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about some work that I've done, perhaps a little bit more on smaller objects, so not so much architecture, but actually smaller objects, the kind of pointlessness of gendered design in many ways, the fact that so many things are gendered these days that need not be, and we might entertain a series of paranoias and ask some questions, maybe reading lots of Philip K. Dick, as Florence mentioned, we can get quite paranoid about why, who is benefiting from this kind of really quite regressive gendered narrative. And we could say, well, on the one hand, of course, people are making money. If you have a pink version and a blue version, there's a kind of consumerism, and some of these gendered items cost more money if they're pink, for example. So like these scooters, the pink one apparently is more expensive than the blue one. Anyway, these are sort of pens for her, because of course you need to have your pen gendered. And in a sense, there's a kind of a lot of online laughing at these kinds of things, right? It's very easy to laugh actually at smaller objects when they're kind of pointlessly gendered, whether they're kind of masculinized, you know, sort of man-like chocolate bars, or, you know, I don't know, princessified cheese or something. I don't know. I mean, you can kind of gender anything in a certain way. And I suppose, you know, on the one hand, it's sort of funny to laugh at those sorts of things, but actually does kind of pose some sort of more serious questions, and especially when we scale up, when we're talking about kind of buildings and so on, which we might, in the first place, assume are gender neutral or something like this, but actually, when we think about it, we work out that they're perhaps not. And I think Hannah's work obviously does this in this very, you know, quite measurable, measured way as well. And thinking about the kind of glitches. And I suppose in a more old-fashioned way, I have been thinking a little bit about older kind of artistic attempts to kind of degender or subvert or transgress the gendering of objects, or to create objects in particular, and perhaps therefore buildings, that are quite disturbing. You know, so here's Oppenheim's sort of furry teacup, which is a very, very curious object that makes you feel quite strange, I think. So I was trying to think about what it might mean to kind of put objects in drag, and whether we can think about drag as a form of kind of the subversion of imposed gender roles. And I suppose when we're talking about the ideology of gender, of course, that, you know, I've mentioned the paranoias we might entertain about why these things are happening. You know, why are we somehow, I think, regressing? You know, certainly my childhood in the 80s was not nearly so gendered as perhaps childhoods today might be. You know, there was a sense of neutrality, and also a kind of political possibility. And maybe I want to raise that question too, about what it means to have sort of ungendered expectations, you know, to say, well, okay, you're a girl, you're a boy, but you can do and be anything. You can like whatever you like. You can wear whatever you want. And it seems to me that we've kind of slid back from that moment, which was in a sense a kind of congealing of a second wave feminist point about the relationship between sex and gender, and that gender is a kind of imposition on top of sex, and it's a kind of a series of roles, but also a series of roles that create desires and expectations, but also kind of dissonance and upset, you know, when people don't fulfill these roles. That can be cause of great upset. And I suppose the question for me and others might be, well, what's happening? What's happened? Why have we seemingly kind of regressed in a certain way? And how then can we think that about subverting these things, whether we're talking about objects, buildings, or indeed the city? And some of my other work has been involved in looking at the sort of sonic aspect of built design in the city. So thinking about the use of pre-recorded, often female-sounding voices in transport hubs in particular. So if you think about buses, if you're in the train station, those kind of announcements, you know, there's Emma Clark's voice on the tube. You know, she was fired probably for doing parodies of her own voice on the tube. Her voice no longer kind of belongs to her, but it belongs to TfL. And so something like 70% of these pre-recorded female-sounding voices in the UK are female-sounding deliberately. And we might ask, again in a sort of like speculative, paranoid way, why? We've already had the discussion in Hannah's talk of Siri and that kind of more personal technology, and obviously those tend to be very feminized, female-sounding, and we can think about those in relation to a kind of long history of secretaries, assistants, and indeed the kind of abuse that people might throw at these things, or the way in which those voices, those female voices, are treated. But also sort of scaling back up then, when we're walking around the city and we're hearing these kind of overwhelmingly female voices, what kind of effect, whether, you know, maybe unconsciously, is that having when we have these voices without bodies, and we're also looking at largely female bodies without voices on kind of billboards and so on. So we have this kind of disconnect, seems to me, between voices and bodies that are very often female. And we might think of this female-sounding voice, and also in supermarkets where the cashiers have all been replaced by these kind of, you know, again, female-sounding, you know, swipe your own automated machines. this voice is not a kind of domineering, authoritarian male voice shouting at you to do something, but more maybe a kind of sort of nanny-ish, maternal voice, sort of softly coercing you to get to the right platform, or, you know. So leaving the question of usefulness of these voices aside, we might want to ask, well, what's the ideology? What's going on? Why are these voices overwhelmingly female? What does this tell us about the city at the micro and the macro levels? And again, how this kind of maybe reinforces certain kinds of sexist or gendered expectations, and then also what we can do about it. I mean, this question of critical design, Florence mentioned, the glitch, and, you know, thinking about, I suppose, alternatives. And again, for me, maybe going back to look at responses to innovations historically in technology. So the Rational Dress Society, for example, was in large part a response to one of the most revolutionary designed objects, which was the bicycle. So for women, you know, the first time in history you could kind of go somewhere without a chaperone, you know, and this, you know, people like Sheila Rowbotham and others, you know, feminist historians, have pointed out that this is actually one of the most revolutionary devices and one of the most kind of groundbreaking historical inventions in that regard. And so here you have an attempt to design clothes that respond to those kind of technological developments, so that allow you, I mean, they don't look very practical, but let's say compared to the alternative, you could wear, you know, these sort of pantaloons and get on your bike and you know, go where you wanted. You know, the kind of emancipatory relation then between objects and the design in response to that. And I suppose maybe this is sort of, you know, I want to sort of put the brakes on some of the way we think about technology and the future of work in particular, thinking about Marina's talk. You know, we are not really at the stage of thinking about, well, let's put it another way. Okay, when we're thinking about full automation or the kind of processes of automation and artificial intelligence and this kind of domination of technology, and of course we are in that world, you know, already, we might want to think about those places and those areas where very serious kind of human ethical questions arise that we will have to kind of collectively ask and answer. And of course these might have to do with gender, they might have to do with sex, whether we're talking about sex robots or not, and the kind of ethics of that. But even before that, we might want to look at those areas where we are very wary of automation. So that would be something, you know, in particular like care work, when we're talking about looking after children, when we're talking about looking after sick people, when we're talking about looking after elderly people. You know, whilst there are attempts to introduce care robots to elderly people in Japan, for example, with the consequence that they increase loneliness, what a surprise. You know, we can also ask the question about, well, what do we actually want to automate? Are we really going to hand over the care of our children to robots? Are we really going to hand over the care of the ill and the vulnerable to systems of automation? And it strikes me that at this point, we would say no, and for very good reason. But what this kind of question, this, you know, thinking about this raises is, well, okay, if we think that that's an ethical issue or something that we need to kind of put the brakes on or say, no, actually, you know, we can't have full automation precisely because we're still human and precisely because we still care for each other, you know, and then we can talk about, well, is care then the central feature of what it means to be human? And if so, this work that has historically been gendered and racialized and treated very badly, unpaid, underpaid, you know, parceled out, just disregarded, in fact, despite the fact that care work and the social reproduction of human beings is, you know, the most necessary thing. We wouldn't exist without it. You know, human beings require a great deal of care throughout their lives. As mammals, we're very, very immature animals for extremely long time. We require looking after. Most of the time, you know, all of us will need care at various points, whether we're ill or elderly or young. So we might want to say, well, doesn't automation actually provide us an opportunity to re-ask the question of care and to re-center the question of care, to think about it in relation to gender and race and money and how we value care and how we should value care, in fact. If we can automate things that we don't want to do, I would also say there are huge questions about the ecological impact of automation. If automation is based on a fossil fuel economy, it's clearly unsustainable, right? We're going to run out of resources. It's a terrible idea to fully automate everything. It will just contribute to the destruction of the planet, which of course we're already in. Again, we might want to think about putting the brakes on. You know, do we really need to automate this many things? We do not yet have artificial wombs, for example. Do we want artificial wombs? I would say no, polemically. We know that technology doesn't particularly save us any time as well. We might want to ask whether it might be more useful to learn some skills instead of relying on technology. I think of my friend who can tell the time of day by looking at the sky, for example. What might our capacities be if we stop relying on technology to do things for us? I find technology immensely confusing, and I also can't make PowerPoint slides. But I would like to just finish perhaps with an image from Hannah Hock and thinking about ways of disrupting, oh God, not that word. Okay, let's say undermining, no, subverting, whatever. What? Glitchifying, we can say glitch. Yeah, I mean, montage, I was thinking when you were talking, maybe montage is a kind of glitch. You know, it's like an early form of glitchifying. Glitchifying is quite good. You know, but this idea of, well, actually, okay, given that we're getting this nonsense, you know, actually, how can we, I don't know, sort of shake these images that we get all too used to, because of course we do, through repetition. You know, the idea that things should be gendered in a particular way. So I suppose really what I'm talking about is these kind of bigger questions, all of which we might need to ask, you know, and speculate upon before we kind of rush in to kind of say, well, we need this design solution or this type of architecture or so on. I think there's got to be a way in which, well, there is already, I mean, these kinds of discussions, you know, those bigger questions are posed at a certain level, and then the kind of question of how that might then filter through, you know. So I think there's a relation between the kind of theoretical and the empirical and the sort of speculative and the design, you know, which is a kind of discussion which is happening, and this is really kind of important. So I suppose what I'm saying is just a kind of plea for these sort of like basic kind of questions around gender and what's happened, I suppose, historically, particularly in the last 20, 30 years, I would say. But, you know, I'm saying that just because I remember those, but probably there are other periods as well we could talk about. So almost a kind of step back in the first place. Yeah, and I'll leave it there. Right, thanks.
Huge thank you to all four of our speakers. We're going to actually have the chance to ask them some questions and determine whether glitchifying is a new word. I mean, I love it. I absolutely think that that's imperative going forward, that we embrace that word fully. So if I can ask you all to just come up here. What's really interesting about what you were saying, Nina, is in all of this, maybe the big questions need to be asked. There's sometimes those kind of shock moments that make you think, hang on, I thought I had this all worked out. Is it Taylor Swift that's just come out in favor of the Democrats that had everyone on Twitter saying, you know, it's Kanye West versus Taylor Swift? Those moments of kind of shock when you start thinking about how things are. So glitchifying, obviously massively important. And I think all of the things you raised were so, it's like, oh God, there's the penny. Well, it has dropped, surely. And that, I think what was really interesting is thinking about how women's bodies and women are often seen as robotic somehow. The sort of, I mean, I'm not a massive fan of Theresa May, but she was called a Maybot. And it's just that sort of, those connections somehow are there so overtly we almost don't see them. So I guess my question to our four panellists, which is probably almost impossible to answer, is how do we glitchify? Florence, maybe I'll ask you first, because how the sort of work you're doing, you talked about sort of more people-based community projects where you are attempting to look at what smart cities, which have been hailed as this kind of answer, but are obviously potentially part of a big problem. How are you personally attempting to glitchify?
I think it's just by involving people, and it sounds really basic because actually certainly if you kind of look at the history of design, this idea of like community-based and participatory design, it's not sort of this new, it's not a particularly new way of approaching the design process from a theoretical perspective, but in practice, one very quickly realizes how you go up against these existing inequalities that actually I feel we've been fairly shy about openly talking about either. Okay, yeah, so I tried to be very careful here because I wasn't around at the time, but my elders often talk about Thatcherism, about Reaganism, about sort of this new idea of what society should be and what its goals should be. And I've often wondered if that's at least one point of interruption or disruption, whatever you want to say, wherein we stopped being as honest about the fact that, no, do you know what, it actually still matters, certainly in the UK, it still matters what accent you speak in. Mm-hmm. It actually still matters like which town you're from and how far north you are. Yeah. Like that, and that physically matters. Like there was quite an interesting report, I think 2 years ago, that The Guardian kind of made a big deal about, was the fact that, you know, young girls in the north of England are actually, are evidently like much more undernourished than girls in the south of England. And, you know, in areas, say, Brighton and Hove, you know, they often talk about how there's the postcode difference. You can predict your life, basically they can almost predict your life expectancy. At the very least, there's almost like a decade worth of difference depending on what postcode you live in. Yeah. And so I think, if anything, sort of trying to glitchify it by involving people, it sounds really basic, but you realise how fundamental that is, because actually people haven't been involved or considered, truly involved or considered, particularly in the development of technology, in the development of new economic models or whatever. And I think part of that is this dishonesty. We still we don't want to say, oh no, classism is still a thing. Oh, quite basic sexism, quite basic racism is actually still a thing. We're not even talking about microaggressions. We're still talking about police brutality that my parents experienced when they came. So, it is almost like the stripping away of a kind of something that we take for granted as truth. I mean, your picture of John and Yoko in the love in bed, there was a great photo that came out last week of the cleaner. Those two were standing back as the cleaner changed the sheets. It's like this kind of, you know, we accept that they are this sort of amazing utopian vision almost of the love-in and the sort of this democratic space of the bed. Actually, you know, they stood there and watched someone change the sheets. So it is it's all about sort of what we choose to believe or what we don't question, I guess, which is so brilliant about your project. How did you start? Was there a moment where you thought, I need to do something?
Yeah, the moment was when I discovered this first thing I told you about, which was that the connection between homemaker and homemaker to woman and computer programmer to men. Yeah. Which was kind of like, okay, this is not normal, and it's the kind of things that we use every day without even noticing. I think to answer kind of the question of glitching, I think as designers, probably the glitching is giving more options, probably, because it feels very much at the moment where there's everything we use and like space and everything, it always feels like there's one option which is designed by one group of people for a certain group of people. And it's also about collaboration and involving more people, I guess, and it's testing those spaces or those those options on different groups of people and giving them a variety of options and then deciding which one is the most optimal. I guess glitching, I think glitching for me is like about, more options probably. Yes.
That sounds like we would all use that search engine if that one existed. I mean, the Google Translate was actually shocking, wasn't it?
But I didn't invent it. It's just me typing on my computer.
Yeah, yes. So, oh, gosh, sorry, I'm just throwing it. So, Nina, what you were saying, I think we all confront these things. As I went to Tesco's to buy my son a ruler for school, they're pink or blue. And I was just like, I just want a clear ruler. They look better. And why are there pink and blue rulers? And obviously I bought him blue, maybe not obviously, he would have said, why have I got a pink ruler? But there is that kind of, it's pervasive, it's everywhere, and it does feel like we haven't moved forward and we're moving backwards. How does that affect what your sort of day-to-day thinking as a
Well, I do. I mean, there is something strange about that, just in, one's own lifetime, like saying, well, why, there has been, at the same time as we might say socially, there's been a kind of questioning of gender roles and kind of, various sorts of social transformations in the way we think about gender. Nevertheless, that sort of imposed gender and those sorts of, the colours, the stereotypes have only gotten worse. And you think, well, why is that, and what kind of boys and girls and men and women are being generated, right, by these things? What does it, like you're saying, what does this do to our conception? And in a sense, of course, then you could come back to me and say, well, what's wrong with, girls wanting to be a princess or boys wanting to play with trucks? And in a sense, absolutely nothing. Right, if that was what people genuinely wanted to do, and if it was also the case that girls could play with trucks, and no one would say that's the wrong thing, you shouldn't be doing that, you should be doing something else. Do you see what I mean? It's not that these things are inherently kind of awful. It's just the narrowness of them, and the fact that they then get tied so closely. And that seems very different from some of the kind of breakthroughs that were happening in the sort of 70s, 80s, and so on. Even while we were, of course, living under Thatcherism and, consumerism as well, there was nevertheless not quite this lockdown. And so I suppose it's thinking beyond the binary, as one of the phrases on the event for today. And how we sort of do that. I mean, is it by saying, that there is no binary somehow? Or is it by saying, well, we need to kind of detach gender from sex and say, well, all right, anybody can be anything and do whatever they want without prohibition, without, being told that they're doing something wrong? And I think there are lots of different strategies. And then obviously it's extremely interesting then to listen to, the design strategies and architectural strategies, from my point of view, and to ask these bigger questions. What does it mean when of course women have been positioned as carers, to then say, well, actually we have this opportunity as humanity together to ask the question of care and to make it the most important thing, actually. And how might we do that, and how might architecture and design respond to the question of care, let's say, as a human capacity.
Yes. Which is interesting at the moment. I think the current move in popular culture is to show AI as getting angry. It's like we didn't even get the chance to be angry. The flipping robots and thinking Westworld, where it's the robots that are angry at being used. We didn't get our chance.
I want to make a comment actually, about the blue and pink rule. I think I agree with you that maybe there are many things to change, but I am hopeful. Like for instance, my nephew lives in London, and he loves to be dressed as Elsa from Frozen. So we just bought him the dress, and but then I read an article in The Guardian that actually is a trend, like many boys like to be dressed as Elsa. So I think in some ways there's like, many moments in which we are more open to this type of transgression, so like not understanding of non-binary. And if you think about also architecture, the entire debate about the bathroom, non-gender bathrooms, I think is quite important. And I have hope, and I've been taking photos of museums in particular from all over the world. Every time I'm going to a museum, I take a photo of the bathrooms and see how they introduce the question of gender. And it's amazing because some cases they have like almost it's like a piece of art. They have a full like wall text explaining, well, this gender is this bathroom is non-gender. If you feel that you want to have a gendered bathroom, you can go to the second floor, and a full statement about contemporary politics. There are many interesting ones in which, they don't want to represent the human body at all, so at the end they just put some water and resources available. So it's like, I don't enter at all in what type of bodies are entering. I just say that there is here a place where you can find water, you can clean yourself and do your necessities. So, and it's hilarious to see how we enter in those spaces as designers, not only as design of the space itself, but also of the signage for it. So I think in some ways, I don't think it's perfect, but I'm hopeful also that having these conversations already, open up. And I like this glitching thing is great, and also what you say about drag. So between, you know, I was thinking about my nephew with this dragging thing. Glitching and dragging, I think, could be very good tools for designers. Yeah.
Actually, I grew up in Brighton, so I don't know what that does to me. I don't know which postcode. I have a feeling it's Hove, where I actually did grow up. But in Brighton, in schools, they brought out the thing last year where they had boys' toilets, girls' toilets, and then children that didn't want to actually identify could have a third, because toilets in schools are kind of war zones as well. And so they had this sort of third bathroom that if you wanted to go to if you didn't identify, or you just wanted to not identify as male or female. And it caused it was, in the national press, it was seen as being outrageous. So actually those sort of architectural sites they're not without kind of confrontation, or even to sort of try and do something that is seen as being this kind of third space where you could go, caused massive controversy, actually. I mean, I think what we were talking about smart cities earlier, and I'd like to sort of touch on that, because increasingly technology is becoming embedded, whether it's through listening to sort of voices. I mean, that's got to be kind of worrying, hasn't it, the idea of smart cities? I mean, Florence, I don't know if you have anything to say on maybe ways that could be dangerous for us. I feel like some of this disrupting and glitchifying relies on us knowing where we need to turn our attention to.
Yeah, and that definitely then, it just shows all the problems again about civic engagement, like how many of us actually understand what's going on in our local councils, how many of us actually understand who's got the rights to build a new development. Like very few of us really understand those innards, and unfortunately we have to do that work. And I think, I mean, for me right now, because I think so far, in fairness, a lot of sort of the smart city projects that you see, certainly in the UK, are actually fairly benign. They're nice things like trying to get people more aware about the environment. But then there's potential for quite dodgy areas. So, for example, crime prediction, which at the moment, again, is like still quite a nice high level. But yeah, you can instantly see in areas that have a lot of tensions between different groups, especially, especially with so much of the rhetoric going on right now, that and then who gets to use that data and where that data is coming from, that becomes a massive, a huge place for concern. So that's at least something that we can maybe start interrogating now, because as I said, right now it's fairly benign. I do think, and sorry, it's great that you mentioned that, because I also wanted to sort of touch on this kind of reconceptualizing of technology, because again, one thing that I think as designers we do need to be critical of is like, okay, is this actually needed? And ideally the whole design thinking and the whole design process is meant to bring that kind of stuff out. And one thing that personally I found generally actually quite helpful was actually when I began to look into non-Western philosophies of technology, so particularly I was quite interested in certain East African philosophies of technology, and how they have a deeply, at least certainly pre-colonial eras, had a deeply humanistic view of technology actually, and this idea of technology as a child of humanity, which is something that, yes, I think theoretically in the West that is part of the tradition, but it's not really embodied in the way we approach technology. And actually just that completely shifted the way then I designed, because I thought actually if I'm thinking of this as a child, if I'm thinking about the Google APIs that I might be casually just adding to a website to show people how busy a particular area is going to be. Actually then, no, if I'm thinking about it as a child, actually I don't want to inflict this on a child actually. It shouldn't have to do this work. It's okay, it's fine. We'll get on with this. It's okay, we don't need that. And so I sort of feel, maybe as well as dragifying and glitchifying, some of it is also like, and
I think
childening.
I know, I totally agree. I mean, I think the older I get, the more sort of concerned I am about, the way in which we are tools of the tool, that we become used, instrumentalized by instruments. And, I don't know, I think I have a sort of very strong Luddite and sort of, tendency, desire actually to kind of, refuse machines actually in many ways, or when you can do things yourself and remember things yourself, for example. I mean, technology stops us remembering things. We no longer remember birthdays or numbers, or because we don't have to. And I really worry about that as a sort of cognitive thing actually.
But I think I agree with you that non-Western centric philosophies are renders technology completely different. So you also think about in Japan or the other Asian countries, the relation between humans and technology is completely different. Maybe it's not one of subordination or exploitation, but cooperation. So if you think about animism and so on, like Shinto philosophies, how they perceive these technologies as something that you are using to solve, just kind of assist you, but rather like it's a kind of a symbiosis. It's also interesting to look. So then the relation that you have with this technology is completely different. And just as a thing that I was thinking loud, but it seems to me that there is also tension that is floating around between this idea of, on the one hand, accounting for different bodies, a diversity, so it's like how spaces should also be designed for a woman, but at the same time, we also want to go into neutral and non-gender spaces or even, designs. So how can we design something that is not discrimination, like discriminating certain bodies, and yet, is diverse enough to encompass and incorporate everyone? So if you think about gender-neutral design, then we are not. How do you design that in a way that is not, again, using a particular database that is only acknowledging or using the average body, that maybe is not mine for sure, like it will be 180 meters, like men, white men. So for me, that's a question that I still don't have an answer for.
Yeah, I guess that's the question, is it inclusivity versus zero? Yeah. So it's how to sort of marry those things up, isn't it? Another same thing. But actually, that's not a particularly good point to end, but I am going to end there, because I think we could probably, it's such an interesting subject, and I think it's kind of all around us, isn't it, the bias? So I want to say a really massive thank you to actually glitchifying Hannah at evening and just making us think about this really interesting, vitally important subject, and allowing us to invite Florence and Marina and Nina here this evening. So I'd like to say a massive thank you to the four of you, and a big thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Thank you.